differences. It's striking on the one hand that we see men and women in some senses being very similar in certain respects, but then in these key respects, reaching potentially different conclusions and a potentially new gender divide, at least for some of these individuals. So I think I've spent maybe 6 or 7 minutes on a 300-page book trying to summarize this. There is much more that can be said because this is a very rich book. And as I'm sure our other panelists will do, this work raises many, many questions. Here are some of them. But let me stop now and turn things over to Dalton.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Matthew and everybody for holding this, and to Kathleen for providing the reason for getting together and discussing these important issues. The way I see the book is really a call for, or an endeavor in looking at process, whereas folks like Larry and I look at outcomes, the horse race, so to speak. And what Kathleen discovers is that the word that keeps coming back to me is flexibility, that the more flexible families can become, both initially but in their roles, but also the kids in adapting to changing circumstances. She paints a picture of family life that is very fluid and has been chronicled as well in this regard by her colleague at Johns Hopkins, Andy Cherlin, whose recent book, American Marriage Go Round, makes a nice companion book, I think, to this, where, for example, he describes that because of our dual cultural heritage of Puritanism on the one hand and highly individualistic culture on the other, where there's an imperative to self-fulfillment, we end up with this sort of very idealistic view towards relationships, but then they fall apart when they don't meet those ideals. And Kathleen's really studying the aftermath to a certain extent of that clash and how it's being renegotiated on the ground. So I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about some of the other context and other evidence for this kind of idea that we're in a snapshot of an ongoing revolution, or ongoing transformation in family life in America, and then to shift gears a little bit and talk about within family issues, which I've studied, and how they might relate. So I want to give you some other statistics. She gives us lots of them in the book. For example, that women's share of the income has risen to 44%. Men's housework has doubled in a generation. So I want to give you some other ones as well. For the first time, there are more women in the labor market than men, thanks to the recession. Doing its part for the gender revolution, because male industries have been more hard hit than female occupational sectors. 40% of the rise of income inequality in the last 3 decades, according to demographer Christine Schwartz at Wisconsin, can be attributed, of family income, can be attributed to changes in family structure. And I don't mean single versus dual parent household, I mean solely assortative mating. So in the old days, so to speak, it was less like if you, as a male moved up the income ladder, as we moved up the income ladder of men, their partner was less likely to work. So in other words, a, quote, stay-at-home wife was a luxury good that you could afford. And today, after the gender revolution, that relationship between income and the labor elasticity of the second earner, which is itself a loaded term, but it's no longer the second earner since more women are in the labor force, but of women's labor force participation is actually flipped. So the further up you go, the income ladder, the more likely that both are likely to work. And that, of course, contributes because the lawyers are marrying the lawyers and the cashier is marrying the cashier, and perhaps one of those cashiers is out of work. These changing dynamics are related to the overall trends in income inequality we see. The higher income folks are working more hours. Their kids are spending 40% more time than their lower income counterparts in structured activities outside of school. Overall, since 1980, kids are spending 2.5 times more of their waking hours in structured activities other than school. This is an incredible change, and yet we're also, because we're working more hours, but we're also spending more time with our kids. So where is this time coming from, this magical extra hours? Well, people tell survey researchers, which I don't believe, that they sleep an hour less than people said in the 60s. I think, you know, if you've watched Mad Men, I think we're just drinking a lot less. Mixing up those cocktails, I think that's where that hour went. Some other statistics that might be helpful in framing this, besides assortative mating on income or on education, there's been age assortative mating. So I looked at a paper by Karen Rolfin and Joseph Ferry that traced age of partners from 1850 through 2000 in the census, and they found that between 1850 and 1980, it was pretty much fluctuating between 13 and 15% of marriages were such that the woman was older than the man in the marriage. But since 1980, that figure went from somewhere around 14% to 21% in 2000. That's another radical change in age. I'll give you another example of, you know, I love these kind of more obscure indicators. Height. I've done my own calculations and found that since 1986, there's been an over 10% increase in the number of marriages where the woman's taller than the man. You know, I don't know where I'm going to publish that, or if I do, but the Journal of Height Studies. But
you should add that. You should add to that studies of sexual objects. You know, that as well. I've always said equality didn't necessarily mean the world would get better. Men would just get
shorter,
shorter, and treated as sex objects just the way women once was.
So I want to sort of suggest that I think we're in the midst of I agree 100% that the revolution's unfinished, and we're in the midst of these very, very important changes that are going on. And so I appreciate the idea of focusing on process, and that there are no outcomes that are given based on I quote, traditional family structure, or one that changes in a certain way from single parenthood to traditional, from traditional single parenthood, or any of those other forms. But now's the time to say where I would have liked to see a little bit more of, and this comes to the issue of intra-family differences, because in my own work from a few years ago, where we did a lot of interviews, we found that I think Kathleen does this as well, you know, kind of cuts through this very politicized debate about family breakup. You know, we have, you know, Judy Wallerstein and Linda Wade on one side saying, you know, basically divorce is terrible and stay together, and, you know, people like Hetherington and John Kerry on the other side, not that John Kerry, saying that, you know, kids are resilient, and it's always better to get out of a bad situation. And Kathleen rightly complicates those narratives. But I wanted to add another complication, is that she couldn't address this in her study because she was, you know, piggybacking on the native sample of the second generation study. But in our study, we interviewed sibling sets. So we always interviewed more than one kid from the same family, and we got very different accounts of the family trajectory from the different kids. And what we found were two main themes. One was what I call escape from disaster, that the kids that were out of the household already, leading up to the divorce, the intense conflict that leads to that, and then post a family breakup, parental breakup, were spared most of the worst outcomes. And partly because we also discovered what we call the Cinderella Effect, meaning Cinderella is a birth order, the Cinderella Effect is a birth order gender interaction. So we found that among the kids that, so first of all, it would be better to be the firstborn and be already out of the house. But if you're not, during parental conflict or separation, but if you're going to be among those left at home, being in the firstborn is the worst position to be in, and in fact, particularly bad if you're female. And that's why we call it the Cinderella effect, because that person often took on the role of basically additional caregiver to the younger children, helping out disproportionately with housework, even being a kind of peer companion to the remaining parent at home. And while Cinderella had a fairy godmother to wave the wand and turn the pumpkin into the chariot, most of these folks who we interviewed were quite bitter later on about having to make these sacrifices while their younger or older siblings got a free ride or escaped, in a sense, while they were tied down to this role and had to forsake educational opportunities and so forth. So I think, I would love to hear how Kathleen feels that her process orientation refutes or confirms what we thought we found. Lastly, I want to say that she does talk about the notion that what allows a family to be flexible, which is given as a good thing. And of course, resources are a big factor, whether they can buy additional child care in the marketplace, for example, to ease with these tensions. The one thing I will chide her on is I think there's a little too much of an optimistic tone in the book, that everything's going to work out okay. And if you read this in conjunction with, say, the Cherlin book, where he reports that 8% of American kids will experience 3 or more maternal partners by age 16, and another 17% will experience 2 maternal partners before the age of 16. Enormous amount of emotional churning for children. I don't think we know the consequences, even for these 18 to 30-year-olds yet, of that. And we know that, even forget about the psychological aspects, the amount, as Jacob Hacker has documented, the amount of household income volatility has increased by 2.5-fold since the 70s. And when you dig a little deeper and you look at papers by, for example, Molly Dahl of the Congressional Budget Office, you find that the story of the pernicious employers and the more flexible employer-employee relationship is not what's explaining that income volatility. In fact, that's been flat since 1980, which is they can't go all the way back to the 70s, but they can go to 1980, and they find it's flat. Your individual wage volatility. What's driving the Hacker result is actually this family churning of earners moving in and out of the household, of women in particular who are vulnerable to an income when they are having primary income leaving when they have primary child care responsibilities. So I would like to see Kathleen address, and I know that there's policy solutions, and I'm going to. I'm here with the chancellor of the Luxembourg Income Study, so I'll leave that for her. So thank you very much.
Right, and how do you work?
Oh, I'm so glad you used the word psychological, Dalton.
Did I say that?
Yes, you did. You actually did. Here
My
I am
mistake.
amidst the sociologists.
Do you feel surrounded?
I do. I'm fascinated. All these figures, I'm trying to integrate them. So you'll see I'm coming from a different place. First of all, what I love most about this book, The Unfinished Revolution, and I think it's hugely important contribution, is the call for a reframing of the debate around families. I mean, I think, I hope this gets picked up, Kathleen, that the discussion of which it seems so sort of bizarrely American in a certain way, it's like, which is the best form of family, because I've got to have that one, is it, And to say that there's not a best form of family, and really to take that on, I think that's just a huge contribution of this book. Having said that, the unfinished revolution that Kathleen is describing is a move away from what was called, what has been called, is still called, I guess, by some of the family values folks, the traditional family. Well, first of all, the traditional family is not traditional. So, I mean, this is a whole debate premised on a myth. It's for a very sort of small period of time. It was the family of the 1950 suburbs. I mean, I thought this notion that it's such a revolution for women to work. A lot of women have always worked. And in fact, you know, if you take a broader view, the so-called non-working women, I always am amused by this because I raised 3 children. The idea that that was not called working still strikes me as very bizarre. You could say more advantaged women, so-called, who were not working for pay, discovered at a certain point the consequences of not working for pay. That is, if the person who was working for pay, traditionally, quote, a man, left, there was no money. And there was a sudden drop in social status. And of course, that lesson got absorbed. So first of all, the traditional family is not traditional. If you've read Sarah Hrdy's remarkable book, Mothers and Others, she reveals that what's more, it was never traditional. It was never original. The patriarchal family is not the original human family. As she writes she's an evolutionary anthropologist, flexibility is the hallmark of the human family. What I think Kathleen is describing is the end of a myth. And the actual myth, as some of us know, turned out to be something of a nightmare. Because the so-called traditional family was found to be the most dangerous place for women. I mean, the American Medical Association survey about domestic violence and all forms of abuse. In other words, there was something very wrong with that form of family. And again, to refer to Hrdy's work, what she refers to as the hunting hypothesis, that is a contract, a sex contract, where a hunter, a man, you know, provides for his mate in exchange for her assurance of sexual fidelity in order to assure him that the offspring whom he invests in carry his genes. I mean, that sort of sounds like it's plausible, but Sarah Hrdy's work shows that this is the model of the great ape family. It's the model of the chimpanzee family and so forth. It is not the model of the early hominid families because, in fact, what is characteristic of the human species, what distinguishes us as a species from our great ape ancestors, is our capacity for, and this is Hrdy, empathy, mind reading, and collaboration, our capacity for mutual understanding. So what I think Kathleen's book is describing is a move, you could say as an evolutionary move toward a return to a form of family which is in fact much more in tune with our human nature, that is flexible and not traditional. Now, the second point that I want to address is these 18 to 31-year-olds. When were they born? 32? When were they born?
Gosh, I'd have to check my appendix very quickly.
Well, I'm really interested in whose children these children are. They're younger than my
I
children.
call them the children of the gender revolution because they were born during the period in which mothers were going to work, families began to develop more fluid forms. So they grew up in the 80s and 90s.
In the 80s and 90s, correct. That's what I'm,
Correct.
So that's kind of late in terms of the gender
Another way to
revolution.
think, well,
Let me
they
tell you
came
why
of
this,
age
let me
in
tell you
the-
why this interests me.
and
My
the
children
present-
were born in the 60s.
Oh, no, yes, you're right. That's a different generation.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Because these children were born when that revolution had not just begun, but really taken root among ordinary families across the country, that it was a demographic revolution, not merely a political one.
Okay, I guess that's exactly what interests me. Because I'm very interested that they all say to their interviewer that everyone believes in equality between women and men. And nobody wants an unequal relationship. I mean, I think that's really lovely.